Let me start with an announcement. We have, after this session, we are supposed to have a concluding session after, I guess it's at 11:45 p.m. a.m., sorry, p.m. I'm still on Washington time. Rather than the announced presentations by myself, Teresa, and Paul, we thought that it would be a better idea to hear from you on what you particularly take away from all of this discussion you've had over the last day and a half, and preferably to think about what the multilateral agencies could do to help in your particular countries, and focusing, if you will, on the three broad areas that we have defined to give us a sense of your needs, your priorities, and how both the international agencies or, sort of an exchange of views and development of policy and research can help, further your reform agendas in your country. So we will turn it over to you. For the closing panel will be your panel, and we will listen, because I think the whole sense of this meeting is really to encourage an interchange of views rather than, sort of lectures and people summarizing lectures. Good. So that's settled. Let's move on to the session for today. I'm going to talk about the design and management of spending and transfers, and we have a strong panel. We have Ms. Julia Butamati from the state of Sao Paulo. She's also worked in the central government of Brazil. My good friend Jose Arista, president of the Amazon regional government. We worked together in Lima some years ago. It was a great honor and pleasure to do so. We also have Mr. Jinyong Liu, the Deputy Director General of the Department of Treasury from the People's Republic of China, and I think the Chinese example is a very interesting one, and I've had the honor also of working with them over the years, I think maybe about 25 years with the Chinese government. And then also we have from Thailand the Executive Director of the Office of Decentralization, Mr. Chomsakon, who will tell us a little bit about the Thai experience. Now, normally if in a session on decentralization, you would start with this presentation, which is about what it is that people do. What are the assignments and how do you manage it? But because things are so interrelated that it frankly doesn't really matter where you start as long as you realize that it all fits together. And I think that's a sense in which we would want to leave you with now the issue of why countries decentralize. So a primary reason in my experience, one of the main reasons for decentralization is that countries do so for national priorities, quite often to keep the country together and for political economy purposes. It helps build better societies and bring government closer to people. And of course, improving service delivery is a byproduct of this process, and generating sustainable growth is part of the objective. Sometimes it happens, quite often it doesn't. So the question is, why doesn't it happen? And of course, really what one has in this decision as to what the local government should be doing, it's a trade-off, as we emphasized yesterday, between what should be done and decided at the local level and concerns at the national level about minimum standards and effective service delivery. So there's a trade-off that's quite important. And I'll talk a little bit about the importance of the subsidiarity principle, which underlies the European Union Charter, which is that the services should be delivered at the lowest level at which it can be effectively handled. So what does the subsidiarity principle do, and what does it imply for countries like Indonesia and Afghanistan, or Pakistan for that matter, that are going through this process? And is there something to be learned? What are the trade-offs? Now we can spend, sort of a whole seminar studying these issues, so I'll only introduce you to some of these issues. Equally important is the sense of political economy. What is the information generation? Who does what? And how do you manage the process? And can jurisdictions play games with each other? And that, in a sense, is the big lesson that we learned from the European experience, that jurisdictions can play games even if you have reasonably good information. So we shall focus a little bit about key elements of transparency, not say 180 indicators, but one or two things that are extremely important in the governance structures that you would want to look out for. And here are the issues of how you set out your budget systems, what you track, and tracking cash. And the Treasury single accounts are key elements in this. So really, what's also important is to see how recent fads, particularly regarding public-private partnerships and how good they are, need to be kept in context, because public-private partnerships, whilst they do provide for an exchange of better management techniques and also additional finance, carry with them the risk of gameplay, and indeed the experiences of countries that have been very in the forefront, like the United Kingdom, is quite instructive. There are problems with PPPs, and now there is a strengthening of the public expenditure management for provisioning for PPPs, which is extremely important to think through. And especially in regard to projects that are carried out at the subnational level, because the liabilities can be hidden for much, much, much longer. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about planning for results and design of transfers, because again, this is the institutional set of issues. How do you manage an equalization framework? How do you manage a process of transfers for results and performance-based transfers? So that's what we'll talk about this morning. The first thing is, of course, spending. Who does what, and who is held accountable? And I think that's the basic question that underlies the whole decentralization process. The question is whether you go big bang, as in Indonesia, and what are the problems, benefits of going big bang, the political economy benefits, especially in terms of keeping the country together, and the challenges that arise. Or, as in the case of Peru, you have a very gradual process of allocation of responsibilities. So these are two different models, and each have their benefits and costs, and it's useful to have the juxtaposition of the presentations yesterday from Indonesia, and Pepe Ariste here will talk a little bit about the Peruvian case. These are two different models. The problem is, and can one achieve accountability only through the spending side? And the answer is probably no. So really you have to think about not just transfers, but also financing and the information systems that underlie a decentralization process. So quite often there is a political dimension to decentralization. As in Pakistan, the debate over the last couple of years has been only on who does what, and disentangling the overlapping responsibilities which were inherited from the Government of India Act of 1935. So they've disentangled that on the spending side, they've done nothing on the revenue side, and also much to be done on the management of the process. Then there is an issue as to the level at which the services should be delivered. Should you go to the intermediate level? Should you go to the tertiary level? should you go to the very, very local community level. And of course, in any of these decisions, you have to worry about externalities in provision, particularly regarding climate change. Healthcare has huge externalities. National standards are still important. Education also has externalities. So, infrastructure, who does it, how is it financed? And problem is that in order to get accountability, the voters must know that this level of government or this agency is responsible, and that they, at the margin, are paying for it. And that's the sense in which you get an accountability. So for a clearly defined service, and my experience in sort of 15 years of work in Latin America has been that you go to a municipality in Bolivia and ask, what responsibility do you have for education? And they look as if you've come from the moon, in spite of the fact that they've had decentralization for 15 years, and they don't do anything in education because the teachers are hired by the intermediate level, they're paid for by the central government, the infrastructure, building a school is done by the intermediate level with the financing from the central government. What do the local governments do? They build sports facilities. They don't even do the operations and maintenance. But they get money from the HIPC funds directly for education, particularly primary education, but they're not responsible for primary education. So the issue is a question of responsibility. Who do you hold responsible for primary education in Bolivia? And I can't answer that, nor can they. But then how do you get accountability in a system that doesn't clearly define? And I think that's a sense in which the Pakistan government has tried to disentangle responsibilities. But you go too far and you don't give the financing, then again no one is responsible. You end up with unfunded mandates, which are not particularly effective. So voters have to know what each level of government does and hold them responsible. And they will only hold them responsible if they are paying out of their pocket at the margin for it. Not the whole thing, but at the margin they have to feel that they are paying for their schooling or their health care, and that the mayor isn't using the money to build statues for himself or figuratively putting money away in Swiss bank accounts. So the sense of accountability is linked to who does what. And I think there is a problem with the way that overlapping responsibilities particularly have been disseminated in Latin America, partly because the Germans have replicated the system which they inherited after the Second World War. The Germans, by the way, tried to change it in 2006, and they failed. Because once you put in a system, it's very hard to change. So this is a modified subsidiarity principle. And this is from Bernard Daflon in the book that Brosio and I edited in 2006. So on the decentralization side, you want to have push downwards the spending, which is the, I don't know, I don't have a, it's the column on the right-hand side called decentralization. You want to push it down for effective social service provision as far as you can, for participatory control by communities and people who receive the services, and devolution. And of course, as you push it down to the lowest levels, then people are able to judge their providers and their governments in relation to neighboring jurisdictions. But if your jurisdictions are so large, covering maybe 30 or 40, 50 million people, then it's very hard for them to compare with another jurisdiction of 150 million people next door, because the comparisons don't hold. This holds best at the local level or community level. At the same time, you have the political economy going the other way. So if you start from the bottom, you have central governments interested in equalization. They want to make sure that every locality has the ability to provide basic education and healthcare, which is the sense of setting up an equalization framework. They want to make sure that everyone has access, that you have interpersonal equity. So it tends to move the equation the other way. And of course, you have economies of scale in service provision and spillovers and congestion effects, which really require higher levels of coordination and management. Of course, in any system where you have taxation which is managed for the broad-based taxes at a higher level, you need to have mechanisms of redistribution back to local governments. How do you do that? And that's where the coordination, harmonization, and cooperation comes in. So you have these two tendencies, one going towards the central government, minimum standards, and effective service delivery, which is going the other way towards, and is a balance. And in the middle, you have your three levels of government, and perhaps a fourth level in the European Union. You have the supranational level of government. The question is, does the addition of a supranational level change the incentive structures that the central governments may have to manage the system effectively? And that may have happened in Greece and Portugal to some extent in Spain. And then, of course, national governments, policy functions, and equalization and financing. That's typically a central government function. And then provincial functions, which are to finance at the margin, or the regional governments and for accountability, and certainly at the local level, you want to have financing at the margin. So you have these tendencies moving in different directions, and different countries do things differently. So there's no one size fits all, but this is a very nice description, a logical description of the forces that are at play in every country. Whether it's Indonesia or it's Peru, you have the same arguments. And then on top of that, you have the institutional arrangements in each country. In Indonesia, there was a big bang change at the start of the millennium. In Peru, there has been a gradual movement, which again is a different political process at play. And the reason why it was done so quickly in Indonesia was partly because they were going through a crisis, which involved the stability of the country. In Peru, there wasn't that challenge to the unity of the state, and it's much more how do you effectively provide public services and matching what local governments do with the capacities to deliver. So now again, there's merit in that process. So we have no particular strategy to recommend to you. That's your decision. But you decide. Once you have decided, then we'll tell you, or donors or international experts or academics can tell you what the problems are. And let me talk a little bit about some problems. As I said, overlapping functional responsibilities are a problem. If you go to Africa, you go to West Africa, you go to Latin America, many local governments, it's not clear what they're doing. And if you're not clear what you're doing, you have, we were discussing this morning, you have central government providing finances, you've got others, you've got parliamentarians providing for education, you've got NGOs providing for education, you've got local governments providing for education, but that's not their responsibility. So who do you hold responsible for primary education if you're going to allow the decentralization process to take its course? It's not clear. So excessive earmarking, again, distorts the responsibility because it's not, local government does it because the central government is telling them what to do. So whose responsibility is it, central governments or local governments? It's not clear with earmarking. It complicates responsibility. In the Pakistan case, you decentralize to the intermediate tier virtually everything without the financing. And then they say, well, we can't do higher education, we can't do sort of cross-border healthcare, we can't finance this, that, and the other. So the net effect is that nothing gets done. Nobody's responsible. So that doesn't work either. Or you give away too much, as happened in Indonesia with the Big Bang, and local governments have the resources, but the responsibilities are not clear and don't provide healthcare and prefer to buy, for want of a better description, build statues to the mayor, then you still have a problem because the central government responsibility is to make sure that everyone has access to education or access to healthcare. So that still remains a state responsibility. I remember in Nigeria, after the constitutional change, they devolved primary education to local governments, didn't give them any source of financing. So they didn't pay the teachers. And you don't pay the teachers, they come out to strike, And very soon the function was taken away up to the national level and the intermediate tier. So in the Pakistan case, now they've decentralized. This is not the first time they tried decentralization. They tried decentralization in the Musharraf period, supported by the ADB, but it wasn't decentralization. It was a way of bypassing the political parties at the provincial level. So, you know, it seemed to be decentralization, but it wasn't. So you have to be worried about that too. Or now that they have actually given responsibilities, but without finances, then you don't have proper decentralization. And as I said, in the Indonesian case, the effectiveness of service deliveries and the incentives for local governments to provide effectively for what they are responsible for is an issue. And part of the problem may be that they have too many shared resources, or that they don't have enough incentive to use own resources. That's partly because they don't have own source resources. So, I mean, you have perhaps missing elements in the decentralization story in Indonesia. But Indonesia is an excellent case study because you have had a lot of change which enables you to measure and evaluate behavior of local governments and households. So I think there is a problem also, as I said, in Latin America, but the Colombians are, you know, sort of working to disentangle the overlapping responsibilities, which is a good example. So let's look at the minimum standards. Minimum standards imposed by a central government are its responsibility. The Chinese central government says that local governments must provide 9 years of schooling. Some local governments don't have schools. How do you provide for 9 years of schooling when there are no schools? Equalization transfers are only sufficient for current spending. So then it becomes, if the central government imposes a national standard, then the duty is for the central government to look at the infrastructure gaps that might be inherent in meeting those standards. Therefore, the equalization or the minimum standards should be funded with things like the DAK in Indonesia, which is earmarked investment grant, which can be on a performance basis towards infrastructure gaps. But that's not the way it works in Indonesia, at least the way I understand it. So really the question is, can the minimum standards offset assignments, offset accountability, and how do you rationalize it? So you can say that you're giving financing and responsibilities to local governments. If local governments do not effectively provide healthcare and education, you should have sanctions. It then becomes part of a social contract, and if minimum standards are not provided in areas of their own responsibility, then that should be something that can be actionable, partly by the political process, but also you can have legal contracts with the local governments that if they do not provide minimum standards, then they would be sanctioned. The question is, are those sanctions credible? Because if it is financing for basic education or financing for basic healthcare, cutting off the financing is not an answer. It's not a credible threat because it's not going to happen. So it's a difficult problem, and one that you have to keep in mind, especially as you're moving towards planning for results. Planning for results is only feasible if you have sanctions for the non-performance of the agreed results. And if the threat to withhold financing for those results is not credible, the whole process is not going to work. So just a warning, but it's a very important political economy story that has to be thought through. And there's a lot of work being done on an analytic basis to look at these issues. So the other thing that I would say is that if you are thinking of minimum standards and you've already given a lot of resources to local governments through, say, revenue sharing arrangements or devolution of resources, and this is the case also with sharing of natural resources in countries like Colombia, and I think perhaps also in Ecuador, then to try and claw it back by imposing these minimum standards, which look like Gosplan, which are so detailed that nobody can actually understand them, may not work. So really what you want to do is clearly have something like a social contract and say that you have to provide 9 years of schooling of certain quality to qualify for, say, investment grants. then you have a credibility in a multi-period game you can think of in terms of effective sanctions in areas of interest to the local governments. And that's, again, an area of research which is actually quite useful, and particularly for people who are thinking about either national standards or for performance standards as you're moving forward. So think of this as a multi-period game in which you are contracting with local governments, and you have national standards. How do you meet them? You will not meet them by cost plan minimum standards because they don't work. And you don't have a credible sanction because you cannot withhold the funds. The funds have already been given. Or you can't cut off the funds for basic education because then you're shooting yourself in the foot. So you really must think through what can you withhold that the local governments want in a multi-period game to have the right incentives for the local governments to provide these, what should be their services, and which may not work if your political system is not mature enough for yardstick competition to apply. So you remember, this is a process. And you're building a process, you're building the political systems which will take time to evolve, as we're seeing now in the Pakistan case, immature political systems. So you want to think of incentive structures that will make local governments do certain things that they might not otherwise do in areas of their competence. But if you go in with, and I'll come back to this, if you go in with funding in areas of their competence, then you end up by confusing responsibility. And I will come back to this when we talk about performance grants. Let me talk a little bit about expenditure management and accountability, because to me this is really where people go wrong, including in Europe. Incentive structures and accountability is what it's all about. And of course, there are problems. If you don't have proper information on what local governments are doing, or intermediate governments, and they're able to put away resources in off-budget funds and hide operations in state-owned enterprises, or kick the can down the road with public-private partnerships that you're not aware of, you're building up a problem for yourself. And the issue is that you may have incomplete mechanisms to monitor what's going on and incomplete mechanisms to evaluate the assets and liabilities in a medium-term context. It is basically that is the problem. And there are solutions to that. And of course, as I said yesterday, it's not just public liabilities. You have to worry also about private liabilities that may become public liabilities, as Mexican roads in the 1990s, or now in the Spanish and Irish property development. These were not public enterprises. These were private enterprises, collapse of which affected regional banks or private sector banks that led to the need for the state to step in. Otherwise, you have a collapse of the economy. Mexican roads, Spanish and Irish capital development, problems in East Asia in the late 1990s. These are examples of private liabilities that have public costs. So really, Spain used to be compliant. Both Spain and Ireland, just 2 or 3 years ago, I was on the board of the IMF, and they used to be applauded for meeting the Maastricht criteria. Very well. They managed their public finances brilliantly. Low debt, low deficits, well within Maastricht limits. Why did they go wrong? Because you didn't have proper monitoring of the liabilities. And especially when you can shift liabilities to future governments or to governments across the jurisdictions, the neighboring government or to the central government, local governments will do it. It's a game. If you can shift the liability, why not? And especially, in this case we were discussing yesterday with Emilio, if you have one-period elections, then, there's no reason for a mayor or a governor to assume the liability during his period in office. Why should you? Push it away. It's somebody else's problem. You get the benefits and maybe something in your bank accounts. So let's look at this diagram. I'll come back to the discussion. Normally, you have, oh my goodness, 5 minutes, I've just started. Normally you have, say, budgeting and accounting in cash. That's the black circle. That's what countries do, by and large. If you look at the blue diamond, that's if you also include financial assets and liabilities. And some countries are moving to what's called towards accruals. And if you look at the, I guess it's orange, is it? All currently recognized assets and liabilities, and that's the dark reddish 1, 2, 3 hexagon. I got it wrong. And then if you're looking at all future cash and all future rights and obligations in the future, it's the pink box in the outside. This is, if you are able to measure each one of these at every point in time, you cannot have a problem. But what tends to happen is that governments can reduce the cash liabilities or their, what's the F, which is the moves towards accruals, without affecting all liabilities by moving back and forth between these categories. For example, if you sell non-financial assets, which are in R, in the dark red, for cash, which comes in F, you're reducing your liability. It doesn't show up in the current period. Similarly, you can assume future pension liabilities, which is in the E, which is in the out box, for cash and financial assets in F. Again, it benefits the current government, but creates a liability for future governments. So then, of course, you can, as we saw in this mission in Mexico in 2007, some governments were securitizing revenues. What does that do? That creates future revenue streams in F for cash in the current period. Well, wonderful. If it's somebody else's problem. They don't have any revenues when they come into office. But if you're the mayor of Monterrey, you'll be doing very well. Pity the next governor, because he's not going to have any revenue. And in some United States treat borrowing, which is in F, as revenues, which is in C. Now, you say you have balanced budgets, but if you treat borrowing as part of revenues, you have a problem. You can have a problem, and very soon. So the solution is you want to maintain parallel reporting on C, F, R, and to the extent you can on E. Then you cannot play games. And in order to do that, you want the IMF's standards, the GFS 2001 standards, not for reporting to the IMF, but for your own use. Many countries think that, you do the GFS, and that's so that you get your data into the GFS yearbook. That's useless. You want the GFS standards for your own use, to stop gameplay amongst governments, local governments, and if you are in the European Union, gameplay across governments in the European Union in order to address those issues. And there is a strengthening of the accounting rules for public-private partnerships, which you should look at. It's called IPSAS 1932, which puts the onus and early recognition of liabilities on the books of the contracting government, which is in F or R. So you recognize these liabilities up front. If you recognize these liabilities up front, you cannot kick the can down the road. So I think that's a sense in which you really need to think through how these assets and liabilities are being managed. It's not rocket science, but it hasn't been done. And it hasn't been done, I think, partly because I go from country to country. I did a lot of work in Latin America, thanks to Teresa. For my sins, I was appointed head of the public management division, which I knew nothing about until I was appointed. But it was one of the nicest things that FAD did for me, is that there is a division of responsibilities between the World Bank and the IMF. The GFS 2001 is an IMF issue. All this issue of allocation and the design of assets, etc., are not something that the World Bank gets involved in. The World Bank gets involved in the management and design of government financial information management systems. They do not put all of this, which is needed, in the charts of accounts of the GFMISs, either in Pakistan or in Ghana or in Ecuador. or for that matter in Peru or Bolivia, so that you're not able to track the liabilities and assets as they're developed, or the budget allocations. So really, you need to, I see the red card, and I'm only halfway through. So let me quickly move on to, just to say that there's a table you want to look at, which gives you the information requirements which come from the GFS. But if you were thinking of a performance-based system, you want not only the costs of these performance measures, which is your GFS items, which are on the rows. The economic classification is on the rows. The United Nations functional classification is along the column. So you want the columns, you want the rows, and you go along and you want the outputs and outcomes as well in any government financial information management system. This should be the chart of accounts. And the budget classification needs to sit in the chart of accounts. It does not in a lot of the systems put in by the World Bank and the IDB, and also I think the other international agencies, particularly in the Pakistan case, which I'm familiar with. Ghana is another example. It's been done right in some countries. That's usually the exception rather than the rule. So you cannot track what has been allocated, what's been budgeted along the rows. I was going to talk about, I'll just finish with a couple of things. Treasury single accounts is also a very important issue. You can think of Treasury single accounts at subnational levels as part of a national Treasury single account, but then run everything through for donors through this through correspondent accounts. I don't have time to discuss it just now, but it is an important issue. We will talk about the Treasury single account reform in China, which is one of the most important reforms they've done since 1994. On the transfer design, you need own sources of revenues. You want to avoid gap-filling transfers, minimize earmark transfers, and then look at the combination of grants and transfers. Managing performance basis, you need to have essentially the objectives set up. You need the inputs, processes, and outputs, and outcomes. Recognizing the outcomes are not necessarily related to all the inputs. There are external, exogenous forces that affect outcomes. So keeping that in mind, you can set up a multi-period game where you can get local governments to engage effectively in areas to assure effective service delivery. But you will have a problem if you put conditions in areas that are their responsibilities, because that will lead to a diversion of resources. So I'll stop there. Apologize for taking too much time. But let's now move on to our discussants. Teresa, would you like to go first?
Yeah, well, I'll be quite brief, partly to compensate for your overrun.
Thank you. That's what friends are for.
Yeah, actually, if you could attempt to be mutually exclusive so we don't rehash the same thing.
Right. So, and partly because I agree with a lot of the things that Ehtisham has said. So I'll just make a few comments for emphasis or for nuance. I agree that, ideally, the scope and pace of expenditure decentralization should be guided by the principle of subsidiarity, because this is optimal from an efficiency standpoint. But I would caution that in practice, it's often difficult to identify which level of government is better equipped to deliver specific goods and services, because it's difficult to assess the externalities involved in such delivery. So the principle is good, but the application in practice is actually quite complex. Also, optimal expenditure assignments are likely to vary at any point in time within a given level of government, because there are different capacities to deliver these goods and services. And this calls for, in principle, would call for asymmetric expenditure assignments. But we all know that it is very difficult politically to accept the principle of asymmetry in expenditure assignments. These are also likely to vary over time, because subnational capacities evolve over time. And so you need to look at expenditure assignments as a dynamic process rather than necessarily. So you need clarity at any point in time about what you are going to, how the expenditure assignment goes, but it should be also flexibility to evolve as capacities to deliver the services and goods evolve. Also, I mean, actually this has been mentioned, decentralization is often driven more by political than economic motives, and this in practice often leads to assignments of spending responsibilities that are not optimal from an efficiency standpoint. I agree also with the importance of clarity in expenditure assignments. I said that also that yesterday, to promote accountability, avoid duplication and the waste of resources. But again, this is easier said than done, especially when it comes to concurrent responsibilities. And when we take into account the fact that there are vested interests in the bureaucracies at both the national and subnational level to defend their sort of perceived turfs. These tensions are also evident when it comes to the issue of appropriateness of nationally defined minimum standards, because as Hicham said, efficiency consideration here may collide with the distributional considerations. I agree with the point that conditional transfers are the appropriate instrument to pursue the objective of minimum standards, but I really agree also with the point that their design and the monitoring of their appropriate use are quite difficult, given the scope for manipulation and for game playing by the recipient governments. And finally, I completely agree on the need to avoid unfunded mandates. I said that yesterday. These are clearly a source of soft budget constraints, among other things. But I think we should also recognize that it is difficult to determine the amount of resources needed by individual subnational jurisdiction to carry out their assigned spending responsibilities at a standard level of efficiency. I mean, so we should have these principles, but we should recognize that it is difficult to often implement them well in practice. On expenditure management and accountability, I very much agree with Hicham's emphasis on budget transparency and accountability. And the corollary of this is that the priority objective for subnational management, public management reforms should be to ensure sound systems for monitoring the budget execution, accounting, reporting, and that the coverage should be comprehensive to include asset and liabilities, including potential contingent liabilities, which, as Hicham has mentioned. However, again, this is not easy to do in practice because the quantification of contingent liabilities is a very complex. And in fact, now there is a whole strand of technical assistance that, particularly by the Fiscal Affairs Department, that is working with countries at developing methodologies for quantifying fiscal risks, and then making them explicit in the budget documents. Both to ensure, however, both to ensure subnational fiscal sustainability and to promote the pursuit of value for money in subnational spending, I think it's also important to strengthen the budgeting and planning phase of the budget process. I think Hicham has emphasized a lot the budget execution, accounting, and reporting, but one should not forget the importance of strengthening the budgeting and planning process at the subnational level. And in particular, lengthening the time horizon of this process beyond 1 year is useful to minimize spending commitments that start small and then grow over time. It is useful to facilitate the observance of numerical fiscal rules and to reduce the volatility and uncertainty of budgetary resources for subnational spending agencies. And also very important is to improve the subnational government's capacity to prepare reliable forecasts of their main revenue and non-discretionary expenditure categories. Finally, on the design of transfers, I fully endorse Hicham's view on transfer design. And this is an issue, by the way, on which he has a long-standing and deep expertise. I think it was in the mid-90s that you did a book on this. So I commend also to read his writings beyond the presentation. Since international experience, including in Latin America, shows how susceptible this design is to political pressures, and therefore how difficult it is to get consensus on reforms of the system. And we should, in Brazil at the moment, there has been for 2 years an ongoing debate mandated by the Supreme Court ruling on partially reforming the transfer system, just one element of it, and they don't seem to be able to find a solution. I see merits in systems that are based on relatively simple, transparent formulas and that are administered and reviewed periodically by independent bodies like the Indian Finance Commission, rather than by a central government agency. Edisham has made that same point, but he was not able to make it in his presentation due to time constraints.
Thank you, Teresa. Paul?
Thank you, Etisham, for a very interesting presentation. I have just been chopping out points. I'm going to try to go quickly too, so we can stay on schedule. I wanted to just say 4 things quickly. One, I just wanted to remind us that we discussed this a bit yesterday, but information may be necessary for downward accountability, but it's not sufficient. I think that it's really important for countries and donors alike to think more about how to encourage citizens, how to make citizens aware of how they can engage with local governments. This little example I was having the exchange with Roberto about yesterday, I mean, these people the property tax business, they voted for this mayor, but they weren't getting services and they weren't paying their taxes. And so this issue of just getting the systems in place and having the information available isn't enough. People have to know how to use the information, what the avenues are. You know, we do things like citizen report cards and various types of evaluations, ways of more engaging local citizens with the state, I think, are very important in addition to information. A second thing that really struck me, and we haven't talked about it much directly, but when I was looking at some of Etisham's slides, a really critical issue is the way the civil service is managed. Right? They're an important part of costs. We talk about it, we've talked about it in this forum mostly in terms of capacity building, but the remuneration policy, the incentives and all these things, I mean, one of the reason that we have all these parallel mechanisms that bypass building capacity within governments is not just because there isn't capacity, it's because the government can't pay people enough under their civil service rules. So I just wanted to raise this as a thing that in many countries is very important. And that brings me to my third point. And I'm just reinforcing a point we talked about a bit yesterday, but it's very relevant for the expenditure assignment and management issues. And Karen's comments yesterday provoked me to keep this in my mind. This issue of the challenges of the coordination with other agencies for developing the standards, and if you have separate planning and financing agencies, how you link the planning and budgeting and the coordination with civil service reform and so on and so forth. And this is something that we all know about, we all talk about, but there's so little out there about the good practices and efforts in mechanisms for coordinating the various actors at the central government level who have their hands in these policies. And even if you get a good policy passed to follow the kinds of framework issues and principles that we've been talking about the last few days, the way that individual agencies can undermine these things in their implementation if there isn't some kind of a higher accountability mechanism to pull these things together. I wish I had a solution, but we could probably have a whole workshop just on this issue. And then lastly, and this was also a comment that I didn't get to make yesterday, but it tries to, I think, link some of the things you were talking about with Farzana, your presentation yesterday. I continue to worry a bit about all this preoccupation with results because results have gotten so tied to outputs and outcomes. And how do we not lose track of the pieces of the process? And you made this point yesterday, and the piece of the process that have to be in place for any good policy that we have to be sustainable. It's sometimes easier to have results, especially in service delivery, by bypassing the kinds of institutions that you actually need to develop in order to attain the kind of performance that we're looking for, and that relates to the process of developing these systems and things that we've been talking about. So we need to keep that in the back of our minds. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Paul. Very thoughtful and useful comments. Let's start the country presentations with Giulia Putumati from the state of Sao Paulo.
Good morning, distinguished colleagues and experts. Good morning. I would like to thank TADB for this kind invitation and this precious opportunity of sharing so many interesting views on public finance and fiscal affairs. I would like to thank Ms. Farzana Ahmed, Mr. Garcia Lopez, the Asia Pacific and Latin American Caribbean country of practice on managing for development results. This is a wonderful initiative. Professor Zahmad, Smoke, and especially Ms. Minassian for never losing her faith and interest in Brazil. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Well, I'll give a little speech about budget performance and cost accounting programs in the state of Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo is a well-diversified economy and is the center of Brazil's industrial base and of its financial sector. The state of Sao Paulo accounts for 23% of national total exports and 36% of total national imports, as well for 40% of its tax collection, national tax collection. In 1994, Sao Paulo reached a dramatic fiscal situation in public indebtedness and chronic deficits. Public servant salaries had to be paid in installments. Services suppliers were paid on average 6 months in arrears. Judiciary claims against the state were not paid at all. And more than 2,300 construction projects were stopped. Due to high risk perception, interest rates on contractual obligations and debt securities increased exponentially. The fiscal adjustment process was imminent, and Sao Paulo began focusing on 3 main aspects: assets restructuring, debt restructuring, and new public management procedures. According to Dr. Pia Cancelli's yesterday presentation, the fiscal adjustment of Brazilian states has been nationally implemented, and the strict limits imposed by the so-called States Debt Restructuring Fiscal Agreement of 1997, which included, of course, Sao Paulo, together with the implementation of the Fiscal Responsibility Law in 2000, which was later followed by the Fiscal Crimes Law, whose fiscal crimes, penalties, and sanctions were detailed penalties and sanctions of the Fiscal Responsibility Law. Together, those States Debt Financial Agreement and the Fiscal Responsibility Law, we can say so, maintained a tight control on the state's fiscal management by enforcing borrowing restrictions, compliance with debt and personnel expenditure limits, and limits on debt service, as well as compliance of fiscal targets, which are reviewed quarterly, including limits on payroll expenditures. Brazil, unlike many European countries, are responsible, in Brazil, the state governments are responsible for implementing, value and effectively collecting value-added taxes. We call them ICMS, which is a huge deal in Brazil. São Paulo is highly dependent on own revenues, which represent approximately 80% of São Paulo's total revenues, amounting up to 100 billion in 2012. That's in reais. The real to dollar ratio is 2:1, if you just have an idea of how much we're talking about. Measures to improve tax collection were adopted, including the incidence of fines and interest rate on existing ICMS, value-added taxes, debts, better control and supervision, resulting in increased collection of inheritance and donations tax, which is also a state tax, introduction of the electronic invoice, we name it Nota Fiscal Paulista, in 2007, resulted in additional revenues of 1.5 billion up to December 29. And the state also, between 1997 and 2007, the state increased revenues by 35.6 billion reais with the privatization of state-owned enterprises, which had to be reinvested in the state according to the golden rule of the fiscal responsibility law. Important measures of expenditures control included programs for voluntary retirement, control of public expenditures, and especially I would like to stress something, perhaps the most important measure of expenditures control was the modernization of the existing IT infrastructure, which improved transparency, accountability, and social control of the state management as a whole, and the implementation with our unified public financial management system, we name it CAFEM, and the state-level purchase and procurement system, e-procurement, the Bolsa Eletrônica de Compras, we name it BEC, using reference prices and allowing for more competitive and transparent negotiation online, which accounted for savings of approximately 1.5 billion reais between 2000 and 2009. The state's fiscal situation in 2012 is the opposite of 94. Debt payments and other obligations are timely. Revenue grew on a 7% basis in real terms since 2003. Social expenditures and investments are also growing. Fiscal control has been maintained since '96 with operational surpluses and investment growing significantly, reaching approximately 21 billion in 2012, more than twice the value invested in 2002 in real terms. The state outperforms fiscal targets set by the state budget guidelines law and is in full compliance with the limits of the debt set by the fiscal responsibility law. But there is still a long way to go to minimize overlaps in expenditure assignments, reduce disparity in the delivery of essential public services, strengthen capacity to manage own spending responsibilities, and improve transparency and accountability mechanisms, as well as generate appropriate indicators of effectiveness of the state's public policy programs. Therefore, in 2011, with the valuable assistance of the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF, the state began to streamline the performance budget results-based program and a cost accounting system. The cost accounting program is part of an IDB loan named Profisco in the state of São Paulo. The introduction of performance budgeting in the state has its root in the 1988 Federal Constitution that has already incorporated program budgeting in the multi-year plan, similar to the Pakistani MTBF and the Malaysian 5-year plan, whereas in the state of São Paulo it has been fully adopted in the 2003 multi-year plan. Also in 1995, the federal state reform plan actually established management autonomy and commitment to results in our 3 levels of government and in the 3 branches. This was mainly institutional orientation from the federal government. In the state, a supplementary law established also contract management and payment by results, initially adopted by the Finance Secretariat and then Education Secretariat. This was also in 1998. In the early years of 2000, the state also implemented a results-oriented strategic management and contractualization in 3 steps: increasing administrative and financial autonomy, defining goals and indicators, and fully adopting payment by results method. After the preparation and the approval of the multi-year 2012-2015, the state government strengthened the team to support capacity building and determined the Secretary of Penitentiary Administration to be a pilot project for the implementation of the performance budgeting program. The management by results is appropriate given the existing conditions in terms of capabilities and systems, and also because the state organizes its public programs focusing on results. Thus, much of the methodology has already been adopted by the state's entities and would not be difficult to be disseminated. This was a choice. The program team is also being able to set goals with sector linkage regarding strategic guidelines of the government defined in the multi-year plan, identify data and information that are required to generate indicators, and define goals and targets of the multi-year plan. However, the current multi-year plan needs improvements and needs to harmonize standard nomenclature and concepts and allow for a better effective execution to generate useful information. And it also is estimated that by 2014, the implementation of the new methodology on the existing financial systems that will be incorporate the new system would be able to provide comprehensive and reliable data to support both the cost accounting systems as well as the performance budget programs. It is also worth mentioning that great emphasis should be given on training programs for the implementation of the methodology for managing for results, because 2 main focus of the training must be related to developing the methodology and the preparation to conduct field work of implementing it, as well as the preparation of the multi-year plan for applying the new methodology. The preparation of a manual on managing for results and on performance budgeting is also very necessary, since the government's intention is to gradually implement the new methodology in all the state's entities. It is also important, like I mentioned before, to document the concept, to harmonize the terminology, and to prepare a detailed implementation guide methodology. The pilot project using the methodology, like mentioned before, will be the Secretary of Penitentiary Administration. And this would also be an opportunity to test, train, and adjust for the new system. The state of São Paulo is also committed to the implementation of a cost accounting system with the technical assistance also of the Federal Affairs Department of the IMF and the Institute of Economic Research Foundation of the University of São Paulo. This is well under the IDB Profisco financing program. I'm finishing. Which aims at developing and supporting tax authorities management in Brazil. The main goals of the project will be provide consistent information. Let me get to the end, since we have Oh, yes. No, no. No, okay, no. I would like for you to see the last, I have to go through everything again. Yes, here. Provide consistent information to support decision-making, provide benchmark costs for public services, and support formulation of the multi-year plan, like we were saying before, as well as increasing accountability and transparency. I would like to make two final remarks. It is also very important that the definition of cost object take into consideration the organizational structure, as well as their public functions, who is accountable for the unit, the interface between the available resources and the public services provided, as well as the costs that should be part of standard operating procedure. That means a change in culture, like Mr. Garcia mentioned earlier. We're not talking about getting a better hammer. We are talking about moving to Germany or something like that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia. I think Brazil has been a leader in many respects. The IT system, the CIAFI, was one of the first in Latin America to look at the full range of public expenditure management. And I think Sao Paulo has done better in the sense that they have a more modernized framework. So it's been very interesting to look at the Brazilian experience. And they did it because they wanted to do it. And I think that's the one lesson I would draw. It's probably, it's almost unique in that sense. A lot of this was driven because there was the volition. What Brazilians did in 1 year on the CIAFI took the Russians 10. So but with that, I will ask Mr. Arista, governor of the state of the Amazonas, to tell us his experiences, both in Amazonas and in the federal, in the central government.
Thank you, Etishan. I want to thank you also to the ADB and IDB. I want to thank Farzana and Roberto for giving us the chance to share with experience and also to learn from the experience of another countries here. I wanted to put this map because I wanted to see how far is Peru from Filipinas. So in Peru it must be at 9 or 10 o'clock of the night. So at this time, all the Peruvians may be sleeping. Okay. Peru is a unitarian country, and this decentralization is really new. We are one of the last countries in South America that has this decentralization program, and that gives us the chance also to learn from the failures of another countries. For example, we learn not to repeat what the experience of Brazilians or Argentinians, and also Colombians. They have also some problems with the decentralization program, and we learn from their experience. We have 26 regions and more than 1,800 districts. As I said, the decentralization is just new. It's also only 10 years, and we are in the process of consolidation. The resource in the 3 levels of the government. The central government collects the general taxes. I say almost all the taxes. The BIT, it's the IGB, the income taxes, and also the excise taxes on gas and beverages, and custom duties. The central government allocates the resource to the regions according to and the districts according to the population. The local government, that means the districts, collects property taxes such as vehicles, cars, and property taxes as lands. The regional government have only the income of the regional taxes have only proceeded from the central government transfers. The regions cannot create or collect any tax. Also cannot borrow without the approval of the Minister of Economy and Finance. In the case of internal debt, they have to follow some rules of the fiscal prudence. So the regional government, they don't collect any tax, any income. They receive only transfers, and they cannot issue debt. The resource management. In Peru, we have facilitated single treasury account for all the transactions made through the state of the bank. The name of the state of the bank is Banco de la Nación in Spanish. That is a really important instrument because all the transactions that made any local government or regional government is made to the CIAF, the Financial Management System, the CIAF, and is through the National Bank. So there is no way to escape from that control. Nobody can emit liabilities and then not recognize it or issue debts and all of that creative ways to have a soft budget. The control here is, I think, very, very tough, and also is one of the big points for the fiscal discipline in Peru. These two elements, CIAF and single account, allow very detailed control and measurement of financial development. According to the functions of the three levels of government, is also this very clear. The local government is, his duty is to take care of the local markets, to clean the city and all of that small problems. The main issue of the regional government is basically education and health, and also to minor constructions, minor projects. These points, that means, for example, education service, health service, and minor projects, are made under the regulations of the national government. The national government says, for example, if we're going to hire some teacher, the government says, well, the Secretary of Education says, for example, how is going to be the evaluation and what we have to evaluate in order to hire a teacher. Regional governments have no more space. We only do what the secretary says in this case. Other functions such as justice, security, or social programs, for example, cash transfers to the poor people, are made by the central government, even if these poor people or these cash transfers is in the region. That's why I say that this decentralization is step by step. We are learning what the things that we're working in other places, and we're learning to also the experience that have not worked in other places. The result transfers to regional governance. This is a point that maybe we have to work a bit more. I think that this is the next step that we have to focus. The transfers are made by the central government to regional governments in three types. One of the first is the share of taxes. For example, the mining companies, the profits of the mining companies have tax, and this tax is shared between the region and the government, 50-50%. The second point is the budget transfers. I think this is the most important income that has the regions, and the third point is the central government discretion. president says, okay, some regions will, maybe will need, or maybe it's necessary to give some additional amount of money additional to the budget transfer in any month of the year. This is also, as I can see, a political way to keep friendly to all the presidents in all the regions. No president wants to fight with the president. This is the main points. As I can see, the process of decentralization in Peru is very young. We have a lot of steps to give in the future, but I think that the main idea is that we have a fiscal sustainability, not only for the government or local governments, but also mainly in Peru. That's the first point. And the second point, there is no way to shift liabilities to the future, as said Tishan. This is quite important because, as I said before, fiscal sustainability is one point that we have to keep in the future, and because of that, we have low interest rates, we have low inflation, we have an investment degree. So that's all the good things that will in some way give us the chance to grow, to keep growing in the future. This year, for example, the Peruvian economy is growing at 7%. So that's a good number for us, and we hope to keep growing at this rate in the future. That's all I have. Thank you so much. And that's the place where I am.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to meet you again and to hear about this experience. Let me turn now to our colleague from China, Mr. Jinyong Liu. I think the Chinese experience, particularly with the expenditure management reform, which were twofold. One is the adoption of the GFS 2001, which was very difficult in China, and also the Treasury single account were two very landmark achievements in China, which I would recommend, and of course we'll look forward to hearing about them.
Good morning. My English is not very good, so I speak simple and slowly. I'm glad to participate in this forum. This forum, three topics I think is very important to us, helpful to us. For example, change the soft budget countries to hard budget countries. For example, establish the subnational government revenue system, especially main tax system. For example, the transfer year market, change the year market to the equalization transfer. I would like to introduce something about tax system, transfers management, and treasury single account in China. One tax system reform in China. New tax system reform started in 1994. This reform is very successful. VAT is shared by central government and subnational governments. Central government 75%, subnational governments 25%. Income tax is shared after a few years of the reform. Central government 60%, subnational governments 40%. Central government also gave some tax relief term to subnational governments. From 1994 to now is about 19 years. The new tax system is efficiently and elastic. Elastic, I mean the GDP growth is high, is increase faster. The tax revenue also increase faster, and some year the growth slow. Yeah, so the tax revenue is also slow. Next 5 years, in order to continually improve tax system, I think it is important to local governments, especially cities and counties. Cities is third level in China, and the counties is fourth level in China, to set up their own local tax systems. I think the third level and the fourth level is have main tax. For example, property tax now in China is low. Two, transfers management in China. Fiscal and tax reform in 1994 is successful. Since then, central government can get money from rich provinces and cities. For example, Shanghai and Guangdong transfer to poor western provinces. In total government revenue, central government occupy about 50%. Subnational governments occupy 50% now. 2/3 of central government revenue can be transferred to subnational governments. Last year, about over $600 billion US dollar. This transfer, this total. Earmarked transfers in China occupied around 40% of the total transfers, while equalization transfers occupy around 20%. This equalization transfers is made by simple formula. And the rest other transfers occupy around another 40s. These transfers, I think, is between the earmarked transfers and the equalization transfers. Next, we will focus on the relationship between equalization transfers and ER market transfers. That is, increasing the proportion of equalization transfers gradually and reducing the proportion of ER market transfers properly. We will also strengthen transfer distribution management and enhancing the performance of transfers. 3. Treasury single account reform in China. Treasury single account started in 2000. This reform is implemented in several stages. Firstly, we start this reform in central government. We establish zero balance accounts in commercial banks for central government agencies and build GFMIS to ensure that the central disbursement is made timely, as well as relevant information could be collected. Secondly, Treasury single account is asked to establish in provincial level. Each province establishes its own Treasury single account and uses its own information system. Ministry of Finance sets a sample system with all the modules and the functions required. Thus, provincial governments could either use this system directly or improve the existing system according to the requirement. For example, 2/3 of all the provincial governments use the sample system directly, while the rest 1/3 continually use the system with a necessary improvement. Treasury single account is also asked to establish in cities the said government level. Thirdly, in recent years, this reform is carried out in counties, the fourth government level. Ministry of Finance designs a simple system for them. Now, about 900 counties are using this system after making improvements applicable to their situation. In general, we carry out Treasury single account reform step by step, and different levels of governments are responsible for their own Treasury single account management. And the key things is the link. We made the system, the government fiscal management information system. Use this system, link this individual treasury single account. By establishing Treasury single account, budget disbursement is more efficient. The transparency is greatly increased, and monitoring is much easier. Now we can get information on where the money goes and to whom the money pays. At the same time, treasury single account is very beneficial to carry out cash management, which we do mainly in central government and some provincial governments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is very interesting, and I think that the Chinese experience, both with the policy reforms, which was the tax and transfer design together in 1994, and the public expenditure management reform, which is the standards with the GFSM 2001 standard, which was done in parallel with the Treasury single account reform, are immense structural reforms that deserve to be looked at, including by our colleagues from Latin America, because the Chinese have done this under very difficult circumstances, and believe you me that this also involved very difficult political negotiations. So it was not something which was thought up by Zhu Rongji and then implemented the next day. This was designed, discussed, negotiated, and implemented both by Zhu Rongji and then subsequent administrations, and then the Treasury single account reform and the budget standards reform by Lou Jiwei when he was vice minister was done with a lot of very sensitive and hard work, and I congratulate you. And I think, you know, this is a very useful case study for others to look at, because, you know, they've done many things right in this context. Thank you. We look forward to the Thai experience.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, everybody. I'd like to thank you for the organizer that to invite me to join this forum. Upon the topic of design and management of decentralized spending and transfer, in Thailand case, the decentralized spending and transfer was designed by the Constitution in 1997, which meant that central government must be decentralized the power to the locality for more autonomy to improve the public services to the people. In that case, they have what it meant that to draw up the law containing a plan and procedure of decentralization. As a result of the Constitution, the determining plan and process of Decentralization Act of 1999 became effective, as well as the master plan and the operational plan in the year 2000. And due to the Decentralization Act, the National Decentralization Committee has been set to be a mechanism to manage the decentralization process, particularly to clarify the duplication function among central government and local government, and also the local government themselves. And the first thing that the committee must to do is to creating the implementation decentralization plan. Right now we have 2 decentralization plans, and it's around 10 years. Each plan we have 5 years for revising, and the next plan we are drafting. For the first decentralization plan, assign the expenditure assignments by focus on reducing the duplication of functions in 6 categories, including the first one is the infrastructure, such as the local laws, the public utility, city planning, something like this. And the second one is the quality of life promotion, such as the nursery and primary school, public health care, and etc. The third one is the social and community management, like the people registration or ID card. The fourth one is investment, commerce, and tourism promotion. And the fifth category is conservation and management of natural resources and environment. And the last category is about arts, culture and traditional and local wisdom. And in 6th category, we must transfer and in 10 years, within 10 years. In those 6 categories, there are about 245 activities or tasks that must be transferred to local authorities. The management of those tasks divide into types of transferring. The one is the suddenly transfer, because some function can transfer suddenly, such as the admission or allowance, something like this, can transfer suddenly. And the second one is the function that needs to be preparing the readiness of the local authorities. And the last one is the function that need to be amended law to before transfer the function. And in the first plan, we have, as I told you, that we have 245 tasks that must be transferred. From the end of the plan, we can transfer about 181 function to local authority. Is about 73%. That's already transferred to local authority. And the second plan, we put an additional 44 function or tasks to local authorities. And for the result of both plans, we can transfer about 220 tasks or activity to local authority. Is around 76.1%. That's what's transferred to local authority. That is the conclusion of the transferring expenditure. But in the same time, we in the decentralization process, we don't have we not only have just only the expenditure assignment, but we have the revenues and personal transfer as well. Each year, the central government must be transferring the budget is around more than 500 billion Thai baht. Is around maybe about 20 or 30 billion US dollar to local authority. For those, the amount of the revenue that we assign, we are mostly are the taxes, like a chair tax or church surcharge tax that we must transfer by the formula. And another one is the government grant. We have put the target in the constitution or in the law. The target is about we try to increase the proportion of the local revenue compared with the net central government revenue. Around it's not less than 35% is a target. But right now we can improve the revenue of the local authority from around 10%, the proportion about 10% before decentralization. But last decade, we can improve from 10% to 27% right now. They mostly are transferring budget, both in taxes and a government grant. And in the same time, we are more than 10,000 central government officer was transferred to local authority. That means that the fixed cost was transferred to local authority as well. If the people the officer who was transferred are the education area, the central government will transfer the budget as like a salary and then welfare for them as well to the local authorities. This is in the overview of the transferring this expenditure. And however, it looked like Thailand met the success in decentralization, but in fact, in my perspective, I think there are many problems that must concern to be solved in the same time. The first one is I don't know, because in Thailand they begin decentralization nearly the same period with the many countries in these participant rooms and in the participant countries. But in my country we have met maybe different. That the first problem is the readiness of the local government. Because in the first step of the decentralization, we, like Indonesia, like a big bang to suddenly move. So the readiness of local government is a very big problem. We need to, because they have no experience to do the function that was transferred. So they need to training or guiding or assistance before to transfer those functions. The second problem is, the main problem is the willing to transfer of certain government agencies. I noticed that the central government agency no willing to transfer most of them. I noticed from there are no training before transferring the function, or even assistance during the transferring function. But in this case, in my office, we try to set the forum or the training course for the local government to have to build up the capacity to do the transferring function. Another notice of mine is